elsewhere in the late 19th century. If they had happened before, why had they not caused these kinds of famines before? Davis is going to stress the ways in which agricultural production and distribution in India had been forcibly changed to meet the needs of the British Empire. Smallholder producers had been forcibly incorporated into commodity production and financial circuits controlled from overseas. So he says the smallholder producers of India did not start growing crops for sale out of some inherent desire on their part to do so. They did it because they had to. The British powers imposed various laws demanding that taxes be paid in cash, for example, which meant that you had to produce something for sale in order to have cash. Various forms of indebtedness frequently exacerbated this, so people would borrow money to put their crops in the ground and have to pay those debts off, and if they failed to pay them off, they might lose their land or their tools or their savings. The laws of access to land or entitlements under previously existing social systems that regulated the distribution of land and incorporation instead into a system in which your access to land depended purely on your ability to pay various kinds of taxes or costs. In many cases, the need to borrow money in poor years to respond to the failure of crops would be more than could be paid off during good years when crops grew well. And this is tied, of course, to that one of the sort of most central paradoxes of agricultural production, which is that in the best years, prices are low, right? If it's a good year and all farmers have a good year, supplies become so great that prices for those things go down, and you find yourself, in fact, not making more money, even though you had a very good year in terms of production. And this could essentially trap people in cycles of debt and make it impossible to get back out. There was a dramatic deterioration in their terms of trade under the British Empire as well. They became more and more dependent on a smaller number of crops than had previously been the case. The diversification or diversity of agricultural production itself was reduced to supply only those markets for which the global economy placed a demand. And naturally, the ability of the Indians themselves or the people representing them, whether it was the British or even later their own independent government, to stand up politically and confront richer nations about tariffs and exchange rates was highly unequal. So they experienced the declining purchasing power as determined by the market prices for their goods. In other words, they sort of found themselves on a treadmill in which they had to go faster and faster and faster just to keep up. And generally speaking, they fell behind. Davis talks about the gold standard, which we discussed briefly last time, which tied currency values to gold deposits in central banks, which meant that for a central bank to issue more currency, they had to acquire more gold. Right? They couldn't just print more paper money. And in order to acquire gold, they had to have some kind of foreign trade that would enable them to have a surplus with which to buy more gold and then issue more money. Some countries still used silver, copper, and or gold internally. So you might have markets within India in which copper or silver were important currencies of trade, but these didn't translate into purchasing power in international markets. They couldn't pay off international debts with these currencies. Their currencies could get devalued vis-a-vis others just by movements in the international price of gold and the changes in value of other currencies. It made it more expensive to participate in the market as a whole, and it devalued the silver savings of Indian commoners. In other words, if you had a group of people in India for whom a significant amount of their savings was in silver, under the gold standard, basically that silver was no longer something that they could use as a currency in relation to international markets. Debt was denominated in gold, which further compelled export-oriented production. In other words, there was an overriding need imposed by the British and the imperial system and reinforced by these international markets to produce for export rather than to meet local needs. Here's an attempt from an economist by the name of Michael Bordo to explain the gold standard in this time period. In 1834, the United States fixed the price of gold at $20.67 per ounce, and it remained there for 100 years. Other major countries joined the gold standard in the 1870s. The period from 1880 to 1914 is known as the classical gold standard. During that time, the majority of countries adhered in varying degrees to gold. It was also a period of unprecedented economic growth with relatively free trade in goods, labor, and capital. So everybody is pegged to this rate, and all currencies have to be grounded, so to speak, in the gold reserves of the countries issuing those currencies. The gold standard was also an international standard, which in this way determined the value of a country's currency in terms of other countries' currencies. Because adherence to the standard maintained a fixed price for gold, rates of exchange between currencies tied to gold were also necessarily fixed. And because exchange rates were fixed, the gold standard caused price levels around the world to move together. And here again, this is the economic teleconnection that Davis that we talked about last time, in which basically the producers of India had to pay global prices for food, compete in global marketplaces in which prices were essentially beyond their control and reflected international global conditions of supply and demand rather than anything particular to their specific location in India. The fixed exchange rate caused both monetary and non-monetary shocks to be transmitted via flows of gold and capital between countries. A shock in one country affected the domestic money supply, expenditure, price level, and real income in another country. Now, again, as I said before, the gold standard is a hugely complicated, mysterious historical economic phenomenon, and I'm not attempting to explain it in all of its detail here. But the point is that these connections tied the local producers and economies of India into global markets in such a way as to be highly disadvantageous to their ability to supply themselves with food. Davis situates this. He says what he's offering here is an explanation of the production of the third world itself, which is a rather strong claim to make. He points out that during this period of time, the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, Britain was actually in decline industrially. The United States and Germany were growing and developing productive capacity much more quickly than the UK, and were actually more competitive. And Britain was forced to maintain its balance of payments by exploiting its relationships to India and China, its imperial relations, in a complex flow that is summarized here. And this is also from Davis. Basically, the United Kingdom bought cotton in the US with notes from the Bank of England. It needed the cotton to feed its mills, its textile mills. People in the US took these bills to China and used them to buy tea. So now the Chinese have got these notes on the Bank of England. The Chinese used them to buy opium from India, which in fact the British forced them to purchase. So now the banknotes are in India, and they get remitted to Britain in the form of various forms of forced payment, basically. Which is to say the British had the Indian economy under their thumb in such a fashion that their own money would come back to them in a way that they didn't have to pay for. Now, that summarizes an enormous complicated web of relationships much too quickly, but this is the picture that Davis paints for the sort of dying stages of British imperialism in Asia. And he suggests that the extraction of wealth from Asia was Britain's way of holding on to its imperial power even as it lost actual industrial strength relative to Germany and the United States. So, The third world was produced, he says, not merely by famine and famine mortality, but by draining the economic assets and state capacities from places like India. Why call this Holocaust? 30 to 60 million people dead. Deaths that, by most accounts, could have been avoided, and probably should have been avoided. British colonial officials either did nothing or in many cases made it worse. And they did it under the belief or the assertion that interventions into the market by the state to control the price of food were actually counterproductive. This is the straight Adam Smithian free market credo of the time. Their efforts at relief were as cheap and as accessible as possible, right? They're detailed descriptions of what Indian peasants had to do to qualify for food relief during these famines under British rule, right? They had to walk enormous distances to get to the camps where they could get food. Once they got there, they had to do heavy labor all day, every day, in order to qualify for the food they got. And the food that they got was barely enough to keep anyone alive without doing any labor, let alone while they're doing extreme physical labor. Meanwhile, the funds were being used to pay for misadventures in Afghanistan. I'll let you read those passages from Davis. There was a sort of gross distortion of priorities, such that this is why Davis wants to make the case that this is a Holocaust. What do you think? Is it a Holocaust? What we today call the Third World, a Cold War term, is the outgrowth of income and wealth inequalities, the famous development gap that were shaped most decisively in the last quarter of the 19th century when the great non-European peasantries were initially integrated into the world economy. The Depression of 1873, which was known as the Great Depression, until when? 1893, when there was another one, and they called that one the Great Depression, and it was known as the Great Depression until the Great Depression. Nowadays, we almost don't remember the Great Depressions of 1873 and 1893, but they were extreme and severe. You got circumstances at that point in time. We had extra rainfall in some places, including the U.S. and Britain and Ireland. This was also early in the period when California had become a major producer of grain and entered into the world supply chain in ways that strongly affected prices and the well-being of farmers elsewhere. These transfers of raw materials and wealth to the First World can be described in these ways: the demographic decimation, those 30 to 60 million people dead, the uprooting from and elimination of peasant and subsistence food production, and massive internal migrations. So this is the case he's making for a Holocaust in terms of deaths and also a massive redistribution of raw materials and wealth, leaving the Third World in the condition that it was in 1920, give or take, and it's been followed in the 20th century by population explosions in those places under conditions left over from this earlier period of mortality and exploitation. So this is the case Davis is trying to make, and now I want to hear from you whether you agree that these should be known as holocausts. Yeah. Similarities with today, such as? So you see a similarity today in terms of the difficulty of disentangling climate from social or human drivers of well-being, the well-being of large populations, and the availability of explanations that naturalize inequality by pointing to climatological or other factors beyond our control. Is that what you're getting at? Anybody else? Yeah. Mm-hmm. You're talking about people who are not convinced that we're experiencing climate change? Okay, the climate deniers or climate change skeptics of today refusing to see rather than being unable to see the patterns of climate and their human causes. I mean, yeah? So I'm not sure I follow you, but I think I would summarize that with what is the role of intention or intentionality in making something a Holocaust or not a Holocaust? I mean, we all are comfortable with the idea that if a government intentionally goes about killing people, that would count as a Holocaust. But if a government fails to act and people die, and the government can pretend or claim that it wasn't their activities that killed these people, is it no longer a Holocaust? You had your hand up. Where were the boundaries of responsibility? Okay, so the British had an interest in not doing anything because they were busily accumulating profits from the circumstances that made this happen or made this possible. Okay, some of the more interesting parts of this book, including in the chapters that I didn't ask you to read, describe the ways in which earlier governmental systems in both India and China had figured out ways to make it through droughts without having lots of famine mortality. The Chinese in particular, but also the Indian rulers prior to the arrival of the British had elaborate systems for storing surpluses of grain and distributing them, moving them around to meet shortages during periods of drought. And those systems were rendered unworkable or dismantled by the imposition of imperial rule. Yeah?
we think of a lot of these things being like pretty in the past and no longer a problem. When it was in 2007, the price of, I believe it was rice, maybe other wheat, was speculated on and shot up like something like 200-300%, and there were resulting food riots in like 33 countries around the world.
Okay, yeah, just a couple of years ago, before the economic meltdown, there was a lot of talk about food riots. There were a lot of food riots in various parts of the world where the price of basic food, grain staples, and so forth had gone up incredibly in response to a variety of factors, some of which were speculative in international markets, some of which had to do with the conversion of cropland to biofuels production, that sort of thing. Speculation is still, I mean, the whole imposition of, we talked about the WTO the other day, a free market, a free trade regime globally is very much about enabling prices to be set globally for all locations. And that does have highly uneven effects on people's ability to buy food in different parts of the world. What else? Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts on this? Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. It would be interesting to compare it to what Stalin did to the peasantries in the Soviet Union. All right, we will see you next week.